Cool. Sweet. All right. So today we'll talk about the religion and its origins. Like I said, many of us are probably familiar with like the origins of Christianity, maybe Judaism. Islam takes a little bit more explaining. Islam is the youngest of those three religions. Judaism originates in the Middle East and grows around the belief in one God. Then Christianity, builds off of that basically. And then Islam, it doesn't build off Christianity. It kind of spins off in a way that says that Christianity, they got the right God, they've just got the wrong message, basically. So we'll kind of get to what all that means in just a second. So here's the main idea. Islam is a religion that was born and grew in the region that we call the Middle East, we meaning Westerners or Americans. If you can explain the basic beliefs of the religion and talk about the geography of the Middle East, that's what we're looking for today. So Islam originated in a place that's now called Saudi Arabia and other parts of what we call the Middle East. Okay, so in Judaism, the focus might be, the Jews worship God. But there were different prophets that carried the message of God, and like Moses and Elisha and all that. In Christianity, Christ is the Son of God. In most versions of Christianity, he is God himself brought down to earth. In Islam, Muhammad is not a god. He has no godlike powers, and in fact, pretty much any Muslim you would talk to would think you were getting it wrong if you said that they worship Muhammad. They do not. Now, they hold Muhammad in very high respect as a religious leader, as God's prophet. And what we mean by prophet is Muslims believe that Muhammad carried God's message and brought it to people. The message was then put down in the Quran, which is the holy book of Islam. There's a couple other things that Muslims hold as important, and we'll talk about those a little bit later. So they don't see Muhammad as a savior like Jesus or a God. They see him as someone who restored God's true religion to the world, basically, who got God's correct message and passed it on, and that's contained in the Quran and what's called the Hadith, which we'll talk about. Okay, so he was a merchant sometime in his 30s or 40s. He's reported to have begun having religious visions. Revelations from God, being visited by the archangel Gabriel, who's one of God's angels, basically. And so the archangel Gabriel visited Muhammad and told him to recite. And Muhammad basically sort of says, "What do I recite? What are you talking about?" And the angel sort of struck him down and says, "No, recite, just do it." So Muhammad then begins to sort of say these things that are being God's message. Now, they weren't written down immediately. No one was sitting there sort of scribbling as he said these things, because Muhammad was basically off in a cave meditating and when this happened to him. But he began to have these religious messages and then began to tell people. He said, and God said through Muhammad, basically, Muslims believe, that people had distorted the true religion. Muhammad was now carrying God's message to restore the correct one. So what he does, he happens to live in the city called Mecca, and that was a polytheistic city, which means that people worship many different gods. And it's important to understand that it was kind of like when you talk about mythology in a way like Greek and Roman mythology, sort of like that with those different types of gods. But people believed in many gods. But Muhammad was there to tell them about what he saw as the one true God and teach them that this was, the other gods, they had to throw them away and get rid of them, basically. So he developed a large following of people. He became pretty unpopular in Mecca because he was basically saying, okay, so Mecca had a really good business going of people that made pilgrimages to, I'll show it to you, to what's called the Kaaba. So this was a place, it was a shrine for different gods at first, and there were idols within it, and people would go and visit the shrine and, pray to whichever god they needed help from, basically. And so there was a really big business going on in Mecca about this. So there was a lot of money involved in it. And Muhammad was basically saying, no, all these gods are wrong. and you're doing evil to worship them. So we have to strike them down and return to worshiping the one true God. So this was not very popular with the people that controlled Mecca there. So Muhammad and his followers get driven out to a place called Medina. And Medina was far away, and there he goes and preaches some more, and wouldn't call it preaching, more passing on a message, and over time develops a pretty large following, becomes very militarily and politically powerful, and after or as he's alive, and then after, it was then recorded in what was known as the Quran, which is the Muslim religious text. This is the extent of the early years. In the first 100 years or so after Muhammad, the Islamic Empire is one big continuous empire, basically reaching from Spain, and this is where a lot of Spanish words actually have Arabic origins, all the way out to modern day India, basically. Eventually, it sort of collapses, and we won't go into too much about how the different parts break off, but it was a pretty expansive empire. Started out here in what we now call Saudi Arabia and Yemen, and gets bigger and bigger and basically takes over most of this area. And it wasn't Muhammad that did most of this. This is basically under control while Muhammad was alive. And then from there, the different, what were known as caliphs, and you've probably heard the word caliphate getting thrown around in the news a lot, who spread that further. Sometimes it was through conquest. Sometimes it was military victories. Other times it was through pure, just sort of, people going out and spreading the religion as religion spread, saying, hey, we've got the right message. We'd like to tell you about it. What do you think? And people convert. So that's what you get. Okay, so how about the belief system? There are basically 5 pillars. Now, we talked about Lutheran Christianity. We would say that the sort of base belief of Christianity is that people are born into sin. Sin needs salvation. How do you get it? You get it through Jesus. Everybody's got different opinions on how you get it through Jesus. But that's that. So in Islam, there was something what Muslims call the 5 pillars, and these are basically the 5 basic beliefs of Islam. The first one is called the Shahada, and it's just a belief that, okay, there's one God, and Muhammad was his prophet. What that means is basically they believe that the person that carried the perfect message of God was Muhammad. So if anybody else comes around and says, I've got God's message, a Muslim will believe that they are false. Okay, there's a requirement to pray 5 times a day, known as Salah, and you'll often see this when people talk about the Middle East. People will, you'll see Muslims praying. It's a coordinated group prayer. People do pray on their own, but it's not like Christianity in the way that the prayers are timed at different parts of the day, and that's how it goes. Yeah, there's some in the upper right-hand drawer. So that's a requirement. The only times you don't have to do this is if you are if you are physically ill, basically, but it's pretty much a requirement. Zakat is an alms giving to the poor. So this is part of, I think it's maybe a certain percentage, but people are supposed to give to the poor if they are able. Okay, once a year during try that upper right hand drawer. There you go. The Psalm during Ramadan. Ramadan is a monthly, or excuse me, a yearly month-long fasting period, and a Muslim during that period fasts from sun up to sundown. Now, the Islamic calendar operates it's not like our calendar with June, July, August. It's a lunar calendar, which means that it's 28 days per month based on what the moon is doing, basically. So Ramadan can occur in different times of the year for different people. I remember when my roommate in college, he was a backslidden Muslim. I never saw him pray at all, but he had been raised Muslim. He kind of still did Ramadan just to make his parents happy, but he would fast. In December, it was great because the days were very short, so he could get up, maybe around like 6 o'clock, have something to eat, fast throughout the course of the day, and then about 5 o'clock have something to eat. But if that's going on in the summertime, that's a much longer period of fasting. But as good friends, our friends, we all waited for him so he could eat at the proper time. That's the only thing. He did have a prayer rug, and I asked him about it, and he showed it to me, but I never ever saw him use it. His name was Yawar Qadri, but he preferred to be called Spaz, like country music and football. So So that's a month of fasting that occurs every year. And the idea behind the fast is that people spend the time they don't spend eating, praying, reflecting. They also feel what it's like to be hungry, so that sort of feeds into the almsgiving. I'm sorry, they don't eat during when the sun's up. Yeah. So you'd die. Lots of people would die anyway. So yeah, the Hajj is a pilgrimage that Muslims are supposed to undertake at least once in their life to the holy city of Mecca. When they're there, they visit the Kaaba. There are certain rituals that go along with it, such as circling it 7 times. Some people are lucky enough to get close enough to touch this large cube, which is supposed to be God's home on earth, basically. A lot of times when people view this picture, they can't make out at first that these are people. But yeah, these are individual people, and they're circling the Kaaba, and they all wear white as a sign of purity. There's other rituals in Islam that involve ritually purifying yourself. And so, yeah. Yes, it's a large, basically stone cube. It's the best way to describe it. And what covers the outside, I forget the name for it. I used to know. But I think it's the Kiswa, which is basically a covering for the Kaaba. Yeah. Yeah, no, it's really, these are like people down here. So that's a person. So it's pretty tall. Yeah. It's a weird perspective. I could show you on Google Maps like kind of what it looks like. So okay, so to talk about the culture, Cameron mentioned this, that in Islam, okay, so we can even talk sort of openly about kind of some things recently that we've talked about with Charlie Hebdo and things like that. So many Muslims believe it is against God's will to show man or animals in drawing or pictures. Few Muslims today, I think, some do, I'm sure, but I think there are many that still, many are open to taking photographs and things like that. But drawing the prophet is a particularly problematic area. So often you'll see in drawings of Muhammad, in order to try to put in the Quran, kind of pictures to show people what's going on, I guess, his face will often be blotted out, but you may see him surrounded by this sort of flame. This is to sort of show that he was in the middle of a revelation, basically. So often when you see Islamic architecture, there's a lot of geometric shapes, very few animals, but possibly lots of plants and different shapes and triangles and stuff like that. Calligraphy can be used to make things, beautify things. So the Charlie Hebdo cartoons, is anybody familiar with what that was? Anybody can even recall was that last year by now? The Charlie Hebdo shootings. Does anybody remember on Facebook when everybody had the sort of the flag of France in their profile picture? Yeah. Okay. Well. Yeah. So there's been a problem recently where because depicting Muhammad is problematic, there's obviously different levels of what that means. Had I drawn the picture of Muhammad to my roommate in college, she couldn't have cared less, at least as far as I know. All the way up to the level of people that are prepared to kill based on someone drawing it. And the Charlie Hebdo cartoons were depictions of Muhammad that were also they were caricatures, and they were designed to poke fun. This is why some of the terrorists, or the stated reason why some of these terrorist attacks have been occurring. There was a journalist in Denmark who was stabbed by a Muslim man who thought that his drawing of the Prophet Muhammad was sacrilegious, basically. So obviously that's a very small percentage of people who think you should go kill someone over cartoons, but there it is. Okay, so like I said, calligraphy is an important part, and so whereas you might, especially in the early ages of Islam, when the Quran would be very difficult and expensive to get because you can't just print these things. Someone's got to copy them by hand. This is the kind of thing, if you're going to do it, you might as well do it right. And so you'd have very beautiful writing and drawing to try to make it, beautiful, basically. Okay, the word you'll hear come up a lot in Islam, and often you'll hear in the news, is the word jihad. So what's problematic is that, you know, the word, which roughly translate to holy war, can have a lot of different meanings to different people. So there are Muslims and there are texts in the Quran that refer to jihad, and it clearly meant a religious war, as in combat. There are other times in the Quran where Muhammad referred to what he called the greater jihad, which was a spiritual struggle. So it's kind of like if a Christian said that they were going to wage holy war. Well, they might mean the Crusades, where there was an actual holy war. They might mean a spiritual warfare. It might be a little bit vaguer. So there are people in Islam that believe that when God says that believers should undertake jihad, should wage holy war, there are a very small segment that believe that it's actually war. We know that there are people that believe that. There are people who on the other side say it's sort of metaphorical. It's a struggle within yourself to become a better person. And there's people in the middle all along that spectrum. But it's why studying language is important, because it means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. Okay, in Islam, there are two basic denominations. There are a couple others, but this explains some of what goes on in the modern day Middle East today. Two branches of Islam are the Sunni and Shiite Muslims. Okay, let's talk basically what's going on here. So the Sunnis basically, and if you're talking about a Sunni country, you're talking about Syria. Egypt is Sunni. Hi, Anthony. How are you? Good. What's going on in the recording? Who's Anthony? So Sunnis, Syria. So basically, they believe that Muhammad didn't really appoint a successor. So there were some successors after him who were the caliphs, and they led the community. And that's what they believe, is that the Muslim community chose the leader. Sebastian, you okay? All right, stay with me. So the Shiites, on the other hand, believe that Muhammad did appoint a successor. His name was Ali, and so they thought that Muhammad's descendants should be the people that lead the Muslim community. Obviously, a difference of opinion, and when it gets tied into government and politics about who should lead the community, that can become sort of a sticky thing. Within most Muslim, there are secular Muslim countries, but there's a difference between Islam and Christianity in that, for the most part, Jesus didn't really have much to say about government, whereas Muhammad did and governed and was a political leader himself. Jenna. Should lead the Muslim community. So yeah, so when ISIS gets up and says that they want to build a caliphate, they want to set up a proper Islamic community. They're doing it on the grounds. They're Sunni Muslims. They're doing it saying that that's the way it should be. That the Muslim countries now are divided, and their job is to bring them together. One of the things they'll point to is what they would say were the Crusader nations dividing the country. And there's some fact to that the modern day, we might have talked about this at the beginning, but the modern day borders in the Middle East weren't created by, or all, we'll say, created by Muslim nations deciding to form nations. If we look at Iraq, for instance, we can see where that Sunni Shia thing comes into play. I mean, we can still find places in the world where, you know, in the United States, it seems crazy that Protestants and Catholics would ever get into violence against each other. But all you could go to Northern Ireland and find places where like neighborhoods are divided into Catholic and Protestant, and they build what are called peace walls to divide them. So, you know, religious people, it can be problematic sometimes when things happen. It's not always pretty. So if you look at Iraq and you look at the modern day, often very peaceful though. That's the best time. So if you look at Iraq and you look at the borders, these were drawn in a map room at the end of World War I. Iraq, for instance, was run by the British for a couple decades. And what the British basically did is they said, we're going to run this territory called Iraq. What we're going to do is, and this is what they did, we're going to put three groups of people in that country that don't historically get along well together. We're going to put Sunnis, And I think this lower part. No, wait. This part here is more the Sunni part. We're going to have Shias, which are more over here. And then we have a group of people known as the Kurds who don't even want to be part of Iraq. So they group 3 groups of people together in this country that historically don't get along. And they did it so that those people would keep the British there so the British could keep order. So when ISIS says, these borders aren't legitimate, they're doing it on the idea that it wasn't Muslim countries that created those borders. Whether that's good or bad, it's another story. Yeah. Do you want the... Is it showing the map? Okay, good. I want to show the map. Okay. Let me see if I can find it without typing it in. So Mecca is... I'm going to have to type it. Pretty sure I got it. I get it? No. No, definitely not. All right, I'm typing it. Okay, so here's the city of Mecca. You can probably find... I'm guessing that's it. Yep, there it is. The Kaaba. So yeah, so these are all the. This is a mosque that's built around it, and that brings a lot of money into Saudi Arabia, plus all the oil, obviously. So, but that's where it is. Well, a lot of them are really quite wealthy. Yeah, I mean the layout is definitely, but I mean you get that. You go to any like old. Okay, so John, there's a tangent. Yeah, well, hold on. No. I mean, the countries themselves have a lot of wealth, but it's often concentrated in the hands of very few people. Is that better? Oh, okay. All nice and square. So that has to do, yeah, well, I can't get off on that tangent, but okay. So let me wrap it up, Mr. White. Okay. So those 2 basic denominations, sometimes, the splits are very important. When people talk about why are Muslims killing Muslims, it's because, or can be because of this religious split. And the same thing happens between Catholics and Protestants often, not often, but enough that it's like, well, it happens among them too. So in today's world, Islam has the most followers of any religion. Its home is predominantly in the Middle East, but most countries in the world have at least some Muslims. It does not discriminate based on race. It basically never did, whereas other religions may, and that we have records of religions that have discriminated based on race. Islam doesn't do that. The message is considered to be for everybody, basically. So yeah. Fumble. Okay, cool. All right. Make sure you're taking notes. I graded some notes we turned in last week, and I think some people may be confused about whether they're supposed to take notes or not.